Beloved Community Talks. Welcome to the Beloved Community Talks. Together we win facing poverty, racism, and militarism. A special 50th commemorative symposium. In this segment entitled Together We Win Facing Racism, join Dr. Bernice A. King, Dr. John A. Powell, and Professor George Leakey in this beloved community conversation about bridging societal divides and resilience in the face of ongoing racism. Our moderator for this special commemorative edition is Joshua Dubois, CEO of Values Partnerships.
So, good evening, everybody. I want to take this opportunity, first and foremost, to welcome you to the King Center, the official living memorial to the life, work, and legacy of my father, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. And I want to welcome you to this special edition of the Beloved Community Talks. We began this initiative a couple of years ago in honor of the beloved community that my father dreamed of, using the infrastructure that my mother built to bring people together. Creating the beloved community is living the legacy of both of my parents. And before I say anything else, I just wanted to let you know that it's been a full week for me. I think I've had 8 days in a matter of 4 days, very limited sleep. I had an opportunity to go to Memphis on April 2nd with a group of pastors from the metropolitan Atlanta area who are working together in an initiative called Better Together. These pastors, black and white pastors predominantly, have been together for the last year, meeting in small groups, talking about some of the difficult issues around race and racial tension, racial reconciliation, white privilege, systemic racism, and getting the opportunity to really understand and know each other better from their different places of pastoring denominationally. And it's been a very quiet initiative. We intentionally did it that way because we wanted pastors to have the comfort of meeting in these groups without any kind of inhibitions. And we culminated by going to Memphis on Monday, April 2nd, and I want to thank again, as I have previously, Delta Airlines for providing a charter plane for us to go to Memphis. And on April the 3rd, we had an opportunity to be in the same spot, same church that my father spoke from in Memphis. That was a very, believe it or not, Pam, that was a very intimidating moment standing in that pulpit that my father last spoke from. But I thank God for that opportunity. And we came back here on yesterday and had a full day of events, starting with our Martin Luther King Jr. Nonviolent Peace Prize, which we awarded to two attorneys. Attorney Benjamin Ferencz, who happens to be the last living prosecutor of the Nuremberg Nazi trials, a 99-year-old gentleman, still sharp, and still traveling. In fact, he just got back from Europe a few weeks ago before he came here to receive that prize. And then we also gave a prize to Bryan Stevenson of the Equal Justice Initiative. Bryan Stevenson has done a lot of work as it relates to representing those who've been marginalized in the criminal justice system. He actually won a Supreme Court ruling removing mandatory sentences for life sentences for juvenile delinquents, which I think is very significant. And then finally, in April, the end of April, he will be opening a museum in Montgomery, Alabama, where the movement began, entitled From Enslavement to Mass Incarceration, and connecting all of the dots between enslavement through mass incarceration. And there will be a special memorial there, which is the first and only in this nation to lynching. And so I think it's going to be one of the most powerful, transformative museums that we have in this nation. And looking at that very dark history that we lived through as a nation. And hopefully we will learn some very vital and important lessons so that we will not repeat it again. And so after that, we had a special luncheon with them, and then in the afternoon, we had a ceremony where we took a gun and had it burned and turned into shovels, and they also turned them into artwork. It was a very interesting experience for me because I was the one that had to carry the gun. I don't like guns. Grew up in a house without guns. I am literally afraid of guns, but that was a very powerful and healing moment for me as we looked at the impact of gun violence on those of us who have lost loved ones that way, including some of our mothers and other family members. And then yesterday evening, we rang bells at 7:01 p.m. in Atlanta, 6:01 p.m., which was the exact time that my father was shot, assassinated from the balcony of the Lorraine Motel there in Memphis, Tennessee. And afterward, me and my two brothers, their wives, my niece Yolanda Renee, and the rest of the King family laid a wreath at my father's tomb. And then I left there and went to the SELC Women's Drum Major for Justice dinner, where they honored me with that award. And so I have tired myself out. And today we had some other events that we participated in as well. And now we're here. This is an important moment in our nation. And one of the ways that I believe we're going to be able to overcome some of the divide that we're experiencing, particularly as it relates to race, is that we have to begin to have some very serious, hard, difficult, and courageous conversations. And we have to put some things on the table. We have historically sought to avoid these kinds of conversations. But I thank God for the Black Lives Matter movement for really forcing us to look at this issue, to force us to do what Daddy said, to deal with the last vestiges of racism. One of those areas just happens to be one of the most critical areas, has to do with institutional and systemic racism. And so 51 years ago, my father published his last book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. And in that book, he talked about 3 things that he felt threatened our humanity. He called them the triple evils of poverty, racism, and militarism. In some instances, he called it racism, militarism, and extreme materialism. He saw them not as separate and distinct from each other, but he saw them interconnected and intertwined. He knew that if we did not deal with the issue of how we see each other and how we treat each other, it would be very difficult to overcome these evils. He especially felt that as long as we were more of a thing-driven society rather than a person-centered society, these giant triplets would be almost impossible to overcome. And so tonight we're going to explore those relationships, and in particular look at the issue of racism. He left us with something that I think is the crux of the matter when he said, we live in this world house, different cultures, different religions, different experiences. And somehow, because of technology and science, we've got to find a way to move beyond just creating a neighborhood, which technology and science has done. But we have to find a way to create a true brother and sisterhood. That we have to find a way to overcome the chasm between our technological and scientific advancements and our moral and ethical advancements. And he said, we must learn to live together as brothers and sisters, or together we will be forced to perish as fools. God forbid that happen. And I'm very hopeful because I feel that there is a new energy in the atmosphere. There's a new generation that is determined to not let us do business as usual. And so tonight, I want to thank John Powell and George Leakey, who will join in this discussion with me, and our moderator, Joshua Dubois. And I want to thank Joshua and his organization, Values Partnerships, for supporting us as we prepared for the last year for these 50th anniversary events. I also want to thank our partners for this event, the Center for Civil and Human Rights and the Racial Equity Institute. I'd like to thank our main sponsor, PepsiCo. And at this point, and I think I'm still doing this, Benita, Sarah, I'd like to call up the sponsors who have representatives here to make comments. Jordan Ryan from the Carter Center, Lee Centel from the U.S. Civil Rights Trail, and Rita Brock from Volunteers of America, Jen Graham from Civic Dinners. If they would come up at this moment and say a few words. And so this is the beginning. Tomorrow as they're coming, we're going to break through societal silos. Participants in tomorrow's symposium will have a chance to develop ideas in a cross-sector environment, and the desired outcome is that these collaborations will generate ideas about how to build power to make the changes necessary to move our communities forward. We will collect feedback for a white paper, a statement to the public about where we stand in this moment. So each of you are warmly welcome to return for that tomorrow. It begins at 7 a.m. with breakfast and will conclude at 5 p.m. on tomorrow evening. Thank you again, and please welcome Jordan.
We also welcome Jordan Ryan, Vice President for Peace Programs, the Carter Center.
Well, first, Dr. King, you think you're tired, but I am so glad you've got the energy, the passion, the drive that inspires us. Today, you're right, a very special moment in time. We are very hopeful that things are changing because there is a great urgency to do things differently. Dr. King taught us a lot. We're going to hear much more about these triple evils and the intersection of the triple evils tonight and tomorrow. We're very glad that the beloved community and the talk can actually focus on this issue. So from the Carter Center and from President and Mrs. Carter, he's 93 years old, just if you haven't read, he's written his 32nd book on faith, but he's doing well. And he, like Dr. King, a recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, and peace matters. It's that war against violence, it's that war against war that Dr. King spoke so eloquently about, that we need to recharge ourselves, keep our energy up, keep that passion alive that he demonstrated to us. Thank you very much.
I'm Lee Sintel from the Alabama Tourism Department in Montgomery, and it's my pleasure to represent the tourism departments for 14 southern states that have come together as a group to encourage everyone to visit more than 100 civil rights landmarks across the South. We market these collectively under the theme, "What Happened Here Changed the World." And the King Center, the Carter Center, so many sites here in Atlanta, Ebenezer Baptist Church, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, places that you've heard of but may not know that these are tourist attractions that everybody in the world should visit. So we encourage you to pick up a brochure either tonight or tomorrow and visit as many of these sites as possible. And Dr. King, thank you for the opportunity to be with you tonight.
Hi, this is such an honor to be here today, and especially part of the MLK family. My name is Jen Graham, and I'm with Civic Dinners. And one of the things that Dr. King talked about is that, I'm convinced that men hate each other because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. And they don't know each other because they don't communicate with each other. And they don't communicate with each other because they're separated from one another. And so Civic Dinners is one way that we can try to bring people together around the dinner table to have intentional conversations that matter. And so we are honored and so excited to partner with the King Center to launch a conversation called Bridging the Racial Divide. And it's a conversation exploring how exploring our understanding of race and how we can bridge the racial divide and build the beloved community that Dr. King dreamed of. So I invite you to host a dinner. You can go to civicdinners.com, and then you can find the Bridging the Racial Divide conversation and sign up to host or attend. And some hosting is easy. It can be at home or at a restaurant, and you can continue the conversation of what you learned here tonight, as well as what you want to share with friends and neighbors and help get to know one another. So thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sarah Thompson, Special Project Coordinator for the King Center and co-producer for tonight's BCT.
Good evening. Thank you for being here. It's a really important time this week, marking 50 years since the tragic loss of Dr. King and the impact that had on the movement. But you're here, and so we know it's not over yet. I have the distinct honor of introducing our moderator for this evening. But before I do that, I want to invite you all to invest in what we're doing here. In order to continue to be able to offer the beloved community talks and continue to support the renovations that are happening. You saw the beautiful pool, the eternal flame, to keep that burning. We need your help. At this moment, in recognition of the 50 years that we've come through, we're starting a 50 for 50 challenge. That's an invitation for each of you to give $50 or more if you'd like, however much you're able. The way to give in this 50 for 50 challenge is online mostly at mlk50forward.org, mlk50forward.org. But if you'd like to give tonight, when you exit, there will be envelopes available, so you don't even have to wait. Thanks again for being here tonight and for being a part of the generation that connects the 50 years that have come and the 50 and many more that are still to come. And now, onto the program. The moderator for this evening is Joshua Dubois. He's a CNN contributor, so maybe you saw him there. He's an author, and he's the CEO of Values Partnerships, which is a leading consulting company, and he's one of the top voices on community partnerships, religion in the public square, and issues impacting African Americans. Recently, Joshua led the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships under President Obama. He was called the president's pastor-in-chief. That's my time. In the White House, he brought together community leaders from across the ideological spectrum, brought them together to tackle some of the biggest challenges that we face as a nation. He's the author of a best-selling book, The President's Devotional, the daily readings that inspired President Obama. It's a compilation of devotional meditations that he shared and narratives also about faith in public life. Joshua received his master's degree in public affairs from Princeton, their Woodrow Wilson School there, and his bachelor's degree from Boston University. He currently lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife Michelle, son August, and daughter Adelaide. Please join me in welcoming Joshua Dubois.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and good evening, everyone. Y'all can do a little better than that. Good evening, everyone. It is an energetic and exciting and dynamic time to be here in this particular space, right? The day after April 4th, at this moment of bridging commemoration and mobilization. We just, actually, if you all wouldn't mind, just join me in just taking a deep breath. One more. We just want to center ourselves in this space, this neighborhood, this community where so much genius was cultivated, right? And where such tremendous work was based and then went out into the world, and now where such catalytic work is happening as well. We are at the King Center. It's a special moment and a special conversation we're going to have. I want to acknowledge a couple folks. First, I want to acknowledge all the people joining us on the live stream. We have thousands of folks tuning in on Facebook from around the country. Y'all turn around, look at that camera, and wave at them. Hey, everybody. We're glad to have you here and joining us virtually in this conversation. I also want to acknowledge the Reverend Dr. Alveda King, Dr. King's niece, and a board member of the King Center, who's here with us today. We're going to have a great conversation about the triple evils, both as Dr. King described them to us and the state of those evils and the movement to fight them today. And we have some legendary, I don't say that word lightly, but some legendary panelists who are going to be joining us, and I want to introduce them. The first we've already heard from, and it's such an honor to be here with her, a minister of the gospel, a minister of reconciliation, a force for justice and human dignity, both here in the Atlanta community, in our country, and around the world, and the CEO of the King Center. We're going to give her a little bit of a break in the conversation because she is tired, y'all, after having done all that she's had to do over these last few days, and our prayers and our support and our arms are wrapped around her. But please join me in acknowledging and welcoming to the panel the Reverend Dr. Bernice A. King. Also want to welcome now Dr. John A. Powell. John Powell, like I said, I don't use the word legendary lightly. He is really one of the country's leading voices on civil rights, civil liberties, and issues relating to race, poverty, and the law. He currently runs the UC Berkeley Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society. Sounds like a beloved community, a fair and inclusive society. He was also the executive director of the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at The Ohio State University. He's taught at more law schools than I can list or count. He's been an International Human Rights Fellow, a National Legal Director for the ACLU, and has been for decades at the forefront of movements for civil and human rights. Join me in welcoming Dr. John Powell. And last but certainly not least, we have George Leakey. Now, he's a Quaker, and Quakers aren't good at bragging on themselves, but I'm going to brag on him a little bit. George is an activist, a sociologist, a writer, a person who literally, and I'm going to ask him about this, wrote the manual for nonviolent direct action used by many in the civil rights movement when he was training director for Freedom Summer. In so many movements for social change from the 1950s until today, George Leakey has been at the center of them, behind the scenes, just working for justice and civil rights. And we're going to ask him about that legacy and that history and his current work today. Join me in welcoming George Leakey. So friends, we're going to get into our discussion now, learning more about the lives and stories of some of the folks to my right, and then coming out to you all for conversation and Q&A. So let's get going. I'm going to join you over here. How do I get my mic? Great. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much. Oh, and by the way, George has written a book that I'm emphasizing that I love the title, Viking Economics. We're going to be asking him about that as well. All righty. Well, friends, let's get started. This is obviously a very important moment in our country's history. Yesterday was a deeply important day. We've seen the news coverage. Thank you, Dr. King, for leading a national conversation about your father's legacy and helping to remind folks of the importance of his legacy and your mother and its relevance today. But I have a question for you all, and that's, would love your sense of what is it about Dr. King's life that people often miss, whether it's his philosophy, ideology, or his life itself. What do you want to most remind people about him? And would love for the panel to react to that question. Yeah.
Can I go first?
Sure.
He inspired me to get, to go to jail, as he did so many people, and that sit-in moved me to the place where I could actually appreciate how edgy he was, how unwilling he was to be in a comfort zone, but constantly pushing out. And one example of that I'm aware of is those early sermons that he preached about the American dream and how black people should be part of the American dream. And by the time of the 1963 March on Washington, of course, it was, I have a dream. It was actually not a bigger dream. It was a bigger dream, actually, than the American dream was at that time. And it was making more space, being more on the edge. And that was the rest of his career as well, moving into the opposition to the Vietnam War. And then the Poor People's Campaign, always stepping out, always stepping beyond. And that hugely inspired me. And I think it's inspired many people, no doubt, the people here. I wish it would inspire more people in our country to not feel stuck with what we've got and then complaining on each other about it, but to realize, when there's a sense of, where do we go? Go outward, expand.
The edginess, pushing the boundaries. Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. Dr. Powell.
So I think, actually I wrote something on our blog about Dr. King, and one of the things I talked about in the blog was the complexity that we are oftentimes invited to flatten or reduce Dr. King. And depends on, and sometimes that flattening reflects more of us than him. He was obviously a genius and just a great man and leader. He was also growing. We have to remember he died when he was 39. And if you watch the trajectory of his life, he was getting deeper and more profound. And he brought many things to us. Most of them we still haven't learned. So I talked in the blog and I said, King was ready to teach us to become a democracy where all people counted. King was ready to teach us how to make the world a place safe for humans. King was ready to teach us how to connect our faith, our politics, and our lives. We weren't ready to learn.
Wow.
And I don't think we're still ready to learn. I mean, that's the question. That's the struggle that we're dealing with today. And if you look at the work of our institute, and this is not a plug for us, but our leading values and pillars are all built on King. So we talk about, as you said, it's the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society. We talk about the beloved community. We talk about bridging. We talk about a circle of human concern where all people are part of the circle. And we know these things are not easy to grasp, but King's legacy, in some ways, is not even a legacy because it's so alive. It's alive in his daughter. It's alive in all of you. And it's not clear if we will actually embrace his legacy. What is clear to me is that if we don't embrace his legacy, then the future of this country and the future of the world is greatly at risk.
Wow. King, the teacher, the philosophical teacher. Yeah. Dr. King, yeah.
And I think one of the things that most people don't realize is that he was a truth seeker. In the process of learning, he was not afraid to what I call chew the meat and spit out the bones. As he developed his nonviolent philosophy and methodology, he did so by extracting threads of truth from those philosophers and theologians that he studied. And oftentimes, I think our world is so narrow because many of us are brought up in a certain ideological bent. And we get so wedded to that bent that anything that is different from that, we altogether oppose, resist, and don't want to consider that there may be something in there, in that person, in that teaching that we can extract some truth from. And I think that's why he appealed to so many people around the globe. He was a Christian, grounded in his faith, but he also transcended his religion in a way that he spoke a universal language. And in this climate now, we need to embrace more of that because we live, yes, in a much more diverse world. And part of that learning that I talked about is really not being afraid to learn from something that may be totally opposite from what you were raised in, but there may be something in it that you can draw from and incorporate into your life as a valuable truth.
Yeah. King across boundaries, breaking down these ideological walls. And speaking of that, I'd love to ask about that global vision a bit. George, before your work in the civil rights movement, you were active in the Ban the Bomb movement in the 1950s. Dr. Powell, you worked in Mozambique and South America and Western Europe. And Dr. King, a major part of your work here is making sure that the movement in the United States is connected around the globe. You just returned from Italy, where she had a private audience with the Pope, by the way. For those for whom it's not apparent why domestic movement should connect to the global context, for those for whom that bridge doesn't necessarily make sense, could you build that bridge for us? Why is it important for us to think not just about the social justice landscape in the U.S., but also around the globe? Anyone want to take that? And how do they connect? Yeah.
In some ways, the connection is so obvious, it's hard to even articulate, but just to say a couple of things, and going back to what Dr. King just mentioned, one of the things that was amazing about the Reverend Dr. King, the other Reverend Dr. King, and I say that because sometimes we talk about him as a Dr. King, but we don't ground him in his faith.
Yeah.
He was a Reverend, and he deeply embraced his faith and lived it. So it wasn't just what he said on Sunday, it's how he lived his life, it's how he where he went, a letter from a Birmingham jail, where he went when he was lost and confused. He went deep into his religion. And he not only met with kings and high, people of high places, President Johnson, he also met with gang leaders.
Yes, he did.
He understood that there was a relationship, and he talked about us being deeply interconnected. Now, people in the audience or people listening on live stream, if you look at your clothes, if you look at your car, if you look at your watch, you had stuff made from all around the world.
Yeah.
We've had a global economy for a long time, and it's hard to imagine what our life would be without that. And what's happening is the world is getting smaller and smaller. And as the world gets smaller and smaller, we understand from an economic sense that we have to, it's a good thing to have stuff and intelligence and insights from all around the world. But that also means people. And so we can't free up stuff to move around the world, but say to people, stay in your place. The United States has something like 600 military bases all around the world. So the military has understood a long time. Right now, we're in a tussle with China, not just economically, but we're saying the Chinese Sea is straits of 60% of the global economy goes through that. And the Chinese are saying it's theirs, and the United States, no, it can't be theirs. The world cannot stand for one country to claim that piece of land, that ocean. And so the world is going to keep getting smaller. And one of the things that turned even more people against King was when he said, let me look at Vietnam. So the U.S. interest is recognized as global. So our concern has to also be global. And what King did that was so profound that we still haven't learned is that it's not enough to have a relationship with people around the world. We have to have the right relationship. And what we're seeing now is a relationship of domination. Sometimes people call it imperialism. And King was saying, that's wrong. That's a kind of violence itself. And he said, I can't just speak about the violence in the United States and forget about the violence that we're visiting upon Vietnam. So he nominated Thich Nhat Hanh for the Nobel Peace Prize. So all of us, I think, have to sort of recognize that all of our lives are touched by the entire world. I work with some black banks across the country, including in Cleveland. And I said, and I took some bankers to China, and black bankers, and they're saying, why do we need to go to China? And when they looked at their books, 25% of their portfolio was held by foreign nationals, and most of that was China. So we better understand the world and try to be in the right relationship with the world if we're going to have a world.
Yeah. Can have stuff from around the world and not be concerned with the people. That's profound. Anyone else want to speak to Dr. King's global
And I
vision?
just think, it's something as simple as realizing that America is a microcosm of the world. Everybody in here, except maybe those of the First Nation, have their roots in other countries around the world. And so we can't divide and separate ourselves and not be sensitive to, those roots. It's like cutting off yourself, cutting a piece of yourself apart from a part of yourself. And so I think as my father traveled even more, he understood that internationally. But for most of us, you can, especially in a city like Atlanta, some of our coastal cities, you can end up intersecting with people whose ancestors, and some, maybe even first generation now, second generation, who come from someplace else around the world. And so we can't ignore that as a society. It was like we're trying to wipe out, part of our brain and think that, we are Americans first. I would dare say that we're global citizens first.
Yeah. It's not us versus them. We are them in many ways. George.
Can I connect with your earlier point about learning? Because another value of being in touch with people around the world is that we can learn from them. And I was particularly struck in my research on Scandinavia that they figured something out that we are still debating about, and that is the relationship between racism and the economic structure. And that's been an old debate, right? I remember I've heard Bayard Rustin say so many times in the old day, he was one of my mentors also, that if we don't get this economic structure changed, we're going to have ugly racism in 50 years, he used to say, very as vehemently as everything he said. But here we are 50 years later, and we do indeed. But the good news that I bring from Scandinavia is that they did a kind of experiment. That is, they went after, first of all, poverty. They were able to launch people's movements such that they could have nonviolent change and institute a system that would eradicate poverty. So the Scandinavians pretty much figured out how to abolish poverty. And then, after they'd done that, they increasingly got immigrants from countries of color. And so the racism that they inherited, because the white world is racist wherever you could go in the planet, that racism came to the surface, right, in response to these immigrants that were coming in. So I got excited about that because as a young man, I had lived in Norway, and I was wondering, and it was blue eyes everywhere, right, when I lived there. So the big question for me was, so is there indeed does changing the economic system actually support you to deal with racism? And it turns out it does. And they are actually making greater progress on the racism that has come up in their countries than we are making in ours. Even though they got that very late start, because we've had all this opportunity and haven't used it well, and because the opportunity structures in their land, for example, free higher education, that right there, and medical care, quality medical care available to all without regard to cost, and pensions for all, and affirmative action into the economic life, and free job training. And if a job isn't working out, try something else. It's all free anyway. We want to find a way that you can enter this society and really follow your bliss and make it. And the results of that is that they're making faster strides on racism. I was just there in August checking it out with the Government Anti-Racism Center, and they're making faster strides than we are. So, so your dad was right, making that connection, right? And Bayard was right, and Bernie was right in saying we really have to emphasize that if we're going to tackle racism as well, because if we don't, the racism is just going to persist.
So we can learn a ton. I'm going to go look into what Norway is doing on these issues. It feels like Black Lives Matter more in Norway because of these economic systems and policies than they do in too many parts of the United States. It's a fascinating point. George, I want to stick with you for a moment and then broaden out to others. You were a trainer for Freedom Summer, I believe, and you wrote something called the Manual for Direct Action that many activists used during and after Freedom Summer, and you're actually, I believe, revising that manual right now, and we'll be re-releasing it. I'm curious, what was your inspiration? What were the texts? What fed into the Manual for Direct Action? Can you talk about the process of creating that in your work in Freedom Summer? And for Dr. Powell and Dr. King, would love to know from you your experiences, your texts, what literature, what has shaped your philosophy today? But George, talk to us about the Manual for Direct Action.
Well, it was an amazing time when I was involved in the Civil Rights Movement, and a friend of mine also in graduate school at Penn in sociology also involved, and we kept saying, what's needed is a manual, because people are, the newbies who keep joining the Civil Rights Movement as a period of great expansion, are sometimes making mistakes that cost them dearly, even cost their lives. mistakes that if they were manual, you wouldn't make some of those mistakes. So we need a manual, and surely the civil rights leadership is going to do that. And then one day we looked at each other and said, they are way too busy putting out fires, dealing with all the daily emergencies that are going on in the movement. They don't have time to sit back, and we're the people. Graduate school is playland, right? I mean, in terms of time, we're the people with discretionary time. We should write it, and so we did. Even though we were two white boys, we thought, well, it's our contribution, right? And then when I ran into civil rights organizers in the South, I said, oh yeah, we used to call it the first aid handbook, what to do until Dr. King comes. So I'm very grateful that it got used so well there, and also then in the anti-Vietnam War movement and subsequent movements. But now it's 50 years later, right? We've learned so much more about nonviolent direct action, because there have been a lot of experiments since.
What are the source material or experiences? What has shaped your philosophy today?
Well, it's hard to really know. I mean, so there's so many things. My father was also a Christian minister, had a profound impact on me. I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and I paid attention to King, but also paid attention to the fights with Malcolm and Stokely and W.B. Du Bois, and I like to think I continue to learn. More recently, I've been informed by a lot of work around the mind science, how the brain works, but also economics. But I want to go back to a couple of things that was said, and just one, one of my heroes is James Baldwin, and he said, there's no hope for them as long as they think they're white. And he wasn't just playing. I think what he was saying, and I talk about this in a book I've written called Racing to Justice, that the very concept of whiteness as it came out of the Enlightenment Project 400 or 500 years ago was a concept of dominance and a concept of separation. And I talk about 3 or 4 separations. One is man being separated from God, then man being separated from the universe, man being separated from nature, being separated from himself, the mind and body, and then separated from the apparent other. And what you do when you have that separation, you also have domination. So things that you're separate from, and certainly things that you don't understand or control, you're afraid of, which Dr. King already talked about. And so in some ways, and I don't mean white people, but the very concept of whiteness is deeply embroiled with this sense of fear, anxiety of the other, and dominance. And it seems to me, how do we actually address that, as Dr. King talks about in terms of belovedness? And one of the things I think that's really important that I pull from his work, we have a concept called targeted universalism. And I would say, frankly, most people, and I would even say Bernie, don't get the targeted universalism. So King understood that, yes, you have a universal, but you also have a particular. Let's not want to deal with the particularities of Black Lives Matters. So you get stuff like, well, Black Lives Matters, so do White Lives Matters. And what I say is what the term Black Lives Matter really is saying is Black Lives Matter too. And there's never been, as far as I know, and I study this stuff a lot, there's never been a white person killed by police who says, the family, he or she was killed because they're white.
Yeah.
And what Black Lives Matter is saying is that these people being killed every day by the police are not because they're criminals, not because they have a gun, not because they're running away, not because they're being killed because they're black. And that requires a special attention. It's a hate crime. In our society, when you kill someone because of their identity, we say it's not just killing, it's killing plus. And so, and to me, the seeds of that, and that's a central part of our work, the targeted universalism. Yes, we have these universal goals, but we have targeted strategies based on how we're situated within structures and culture. And too often, because people are uncomfortable sometimes with race, it's like, let's not do race. They're very willing to get rid of race and less willing to get rid of racism.
Yeah.
So I'm learning all the time,
yeah,
from my students, from my father, from, I went back just preparing today, rereading King, and I just always amazed how fresh and profound his teachings are.
We have to learn, right? This is a moment where you can almost still hear the echoes of the gunshots from California, where a young man was shot in the back in his grandmother's backyard.
Shot
in New York,
6 times, and the police claim he was running toward them,
Yeah.
and they shot him 6 times in the back.
and handcuffed him as he lay on the ground dying and dead for 5 minutes. Before he actually passed away. Or in New York, so we continue to grapple with the trauma and the mental health issues in our community. A young man who was challenged with mental health issues, walking around with a pipe that was bent, potentially in the shape of a gun, but who knows, and was killed on the streets of New York. We have to learn all the time.
So let me just throw 2 other things I know. I don't want to. There was a case, I think it was in Florida, literally, where you talked about mental health, where a black man had a domestic dispute, clearly disturbed, maybe mentally ill. A white policeman shows up, and he actually starts talking him down.
I saw this, yeah.
And he realized the man has mental illness. Now, a lot of the killings actually involve people with mental illness and race. And he doesn't draw his gun. He's starting to get the man to calm down. His support shows up, 2 other police. They pull out their gun and kill him. The police who didn't pull out his gun gets fired by the police department. It's like saying, why didn't you pull out your gun and kill this guy? We're going to sanction you for not killing this guy. Now, the good thing is the ACLU sued and got him a settlement. But what kind of society is it where you punish people for not killing somebody?
Dr. King, what has shaped your vision up until this day?
Well, I would say probably more than anything, my Christian faith. And not just what I read in the Holy Bible, but what I experienced growing up with a mother who was steeped in her faith. She was perhaps the greatest influence on my life. She taught us very early on of the value of human life and the importance of unconditional love. I remember so often she would say things like, I don't hold grudges. It's one thing to study something, read something, but it's another thing to experience it, because I think that cements it for you. And she really cemented this whole forgiveness for me, because unforgiveness is a roadblock. It disconnects us from humanity, and I had to go through years of wrestling with that. But having my mother there and knowing about her experiences and of people who hurt her, did evil things toward her, but yet she still reached out and embraced those people, was very powerful for me. And then she used to say things like, somebody has to cut off the chain of violence. When you're a child, you don't fully understand all of that. And for us, it's all kids play. If somebody hits me, I'm going to hit them back. If somebody cusses me out, I'm going to cuss them back out. If somebody tries to defeat me, my goal is to defeat them and win over them. And so over and over again, I just watched her in the way in which she conducted her life. And then out of that, I spent years running away from studying my father, partially because I was called into the ministry. And I was called at a young age. I was called at 17. And so as a teenager, I wanted my own identity. And so being called to the ministry was like losing that, because, my father is this, gigantic figure and very revered around the world. And, I didn't want to get swallowed up. So even though I went to seminary, I still did not study him. And I had one course where I had to study him a little bit. I did go through some of the training early on here at the King Center, but I never went any further. I did whatever was, required at the time. And it really wasn't until perhaps my late 30s to early 40s where I really started reading and studying him. But now as I approached him, because I had those life experiences with my mother, because I went through my own personal journey of hating white people, and especially white males, and having to overcome that personally, confront that personally, and coming to a place where I understand what it means by hate is too great a burden to bear. You know, it's not just a T-shirt that we sell the T-shirt, but it's not just words on a T-shirt or on pages. It is real for me because it burdened me down to the point that I was having some physical conditions. And so, if anybody in here is struggling with that, rid yourself of it because it will literally eat you up. And so now I don't hate. There's no room and space for that. Even if great and Daddy used to say, I'm so happy that Jesus didn't say like everyone. And I was like, amen. Because there's just some people you just do not like. But what's amazing for me is that when I look at myself holistically, there are aspects and pieces of me that I don't really care for, But in order to live with me, I had to learn to love me in spite of the aspects of me that I don't like. And so that's helped me in dealing with people because now that I understand that about me, and I can't escape me, I can escape other people, then certainly I can love other people in spite of what I don't like. And so diving now into this philosophy of nonviolence and methodology of nonviolence is much easier for me to grasp. It's much easier for me to talk about because I'm not talking about something that I studied and that's in my head. It's in my heart. It's in my life. It's in my being. And I deeply believe those teachings that my father left with us. Over and over again as I read them, I have not yet come upon something that I disagree with, which, can be a little unusual. And maybe some people think there's a little naivete because that's your dad, so you're just kind of, blind to it. But, the deeper and the more I study him, the more I'm convinced that he's an archetype of Christ. And that God interjected him in time, on time, because of where we were as a nation and ultimately as a world. The pathway, the trajectory that we were on was very dangerous, and we're still kind of edging close to that now. And that's why I think God is still allowing his name to be invoked in the universe. Not to be worshiped, but because he is a modern example of what we are to exhibit and exude in this earth, in this human family that we have been born into and that we live as a part of.
Wow. How powerful. Amen. And my challenge to you all, let's all begin to rediscover Dr. King with fresh eyes and reread and absorb and know. And not just Dr. King, but your mother too. I think one of the most important things that we can do over the next decade is to learn more about the life and legacy and work of Coretta Scott King. I'm ashamed to say that I just found out recently that she went out ahead of your father on the Vietnam War, and that she was the first person to really lead that conversation before passing the baton to your father. I would love for you all to speak, if you don't mind, one, Dr. King, to your mother's legacy, but also just to the importance of women in the movement, an importance that is often overlooked, too often overlooked, but we're beginning to discover more. And as a devotee, and I certainly never met her, but my biggest inspiration in my life is Fannie Lou Hamer. I feel like we can't have enough conversations about the importance of women in the movement. Would you all mind speaking to that just a bit? Are there individuals who really stand out for you? And certainly, Dr. King, if you'd like to share more about your mother's legacy, please do. Yeah.
Well, during the Freedom Summer training, the second week, you may remember there were 2 weeks of the training because it was going for about 1,000 students from the north to come south, work in Mississippi, and do voter registration and so on. So it was, but the students were divided into 2 batches. So there was the first week, and then they got on buses and headed for Mississippi, and then the second week. And it was the second day of the second week when the people up on the stage chatting, among themselves. We were filling the auditorium. We were told we should fill the auditorium. I was sitting over there so I could watch everybody because I'm a sociologist. I got to watch everybody. And so, but it looked like something very somber was happening. And then someone stepped forward and said, there are 3 people who've been disappeared, and they are probably dead. And what those students sitting out there in the auditorium needed to realize immediately realized was that 2 of those 3 had been in those seats the previous week. Wow. And were already dead. And so I, with my sociological head on, thought, well, almost everybody here is going to be out of here by the end of the day. Even if they don't want to, their parents are going to call them and saying, we want you home. You're not going down there, right? And the women so came through as exemplars of courage, supporting the other students. And I think it was partly because of the willingness for people to feel their feelings. If people just felt like I have to, well then, but my mom called, I have to go. No. They created an atmosphere. The SNCC workers were very helpful. We trainers helped. We called off the actual training during the day. There were clumps of people around the trees. Guitars came out. It was like prayer meeting, all day long, in which people were processing, what does it mean to go to Mississippi now that we know this? And the women's role in that, I will never forget. I think if it had been a male, 500 or so, we would have lost most of them.
Wow. They kept people around by creating a space for healing and then for courage to go out and fight the fight. Wow. Anyone else want to speak to that?
Well, when we start talking about the modern day civil rights movement, most people hear the name of Rosa Parks, obviously. But most of the figures that we talk about are my dad, Ralph Abernathy, my uncle A.D., C.T. Vivian, Andrew Young, Joe Lowry, even now, when you think about some of the conversations that we have, I'm always saying, I was looking last night at the C-SPAN, the program they had at the, was it at the museum last night? Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about, God, you would think that there were no women leaders in the movement, because the voices that you hear so often now are males. And yet, the reason that the boycott occurred was not because of men. It was because of the Women's Political Council, who had been calling for and looking for an opportunity to have that boycott. and this became the moment for them to do it. And they were a large part of the contingency of making sure that it had the momentum. You know, had the women not been there, it would have been a 2-hour boycott. I mean, let's just be honest. I mean, all throughout that process, women were all a part of it. And they were strategists. They sat at tables too, but you know, unfortunately, men historically have felt uncomfortable with women's thinking. We do think. We don't just emote.
And Dr. King, is part of that who was allowed behind the pulpit, right? Because that was
yeah, it was enforced by
the space
the church, especially the Baptist church. We were not as liberated. Much more today, but still an issue. And so, you know, God, I mean, I can think of so many who did so much. You know, Andrew Young often talks about my mom and his first wife, Jean Young, and that if they had not married those women, you know, my mom, my dad married Coretta Scott King, him married Jean Young, they probably would never have accomplished what they accomplished because they married very strong, secure women, very educated, very dedicated, very committed to social change, and who perhaps understood nonviolence better than them initially. As you said, my mother worked very early on in the peace movement when she was in college. And so by the time she met my father, he's not the one who brought her along. She was exposed to Gandhi when she was at the Lincoln Normal School when Bayard Rustin came to the school and spoke about Gandhi. My mother was, I think, 16 at the time, and she's 2 years older than my father. Father's would have been 14 at the time. My father was not yet at Morehouse College. And Daddy didn't get exposed to Gandhi until he got to seminary when he was 19, 20. So the early seeds were already there with her. But, you know, women have always been that force, that glue, that critical aspect. And my mother said something very important. And she said it in 1968 at the Poor People's Campaign in June, 50 years ago. She said, "Women, if the soul of the nation is to be saved, I believe you must become its soul." And, you know, although there's been an effort to oppress, repress, suppress, depress, any others, suppress women, the reality is that most effective social change throughout the world, if we study it, involve two critical groups: women and youth. There's no escaping it.
Wow. So your mom was previewing the Women's March and the Youth March, and Tamika Mallory and Bree Newsom and Brittany Packnett and so many others who are doing great work. And speaking of them, I want to build a bridge to the present day movement today. What is the health of movements for social change today? Are we effectively confronting poverty, racism, and militarism? Where are we strong? Where do we need to grow? Speak to the health of the present day movement, if you wouldn't mind. And from people who, I want to be clear, are actively still involved in the movement, all three of them. George was arrested last week protesting a utility company in Philadelphia. So I'd love for you to speak to the health of the movement as somebody who just got out of jail. But yeah, if you all could talk a little bit about the health of the movement today.
I'll start, and I'll bridge it with your earlier question. And I'll just, first of all, just say, I have a really, really wonderful family. And I just left my dad, who's 97, been cared for my sister, who's in her 70s. She just had a serious operation. She lost all her toes, and the family's coming together. I have 5 sisters. It's hard for me to actually say enough about my family, and I think for a lot of us, not just in terms of movement, but our exercise, our teaching in terms of loving and caring, and I know sometimes people don't like that, but I think my first love was my mom, she died almost 20 years ago. I still miss her. So it's just profound. I mean, I won't go into a great detail, but you asked about current movements. 2 points I want to make. There's a book called The Race Between Education and Technology, written by a couple of Harvard economists, actually. One of them's a friend. And they point out that the thing that made the United States a powerhouse economically in the 20th century, was we were the first country that began to, didn't do it completely, and still haven't done it completely, although began to bring women into the education arena. So every other country was playing with half a deck. And when they start bringing women in large numbers, things start changing. The country became much more dynamic. You released all of that energy. And Dr. King, I studied the brain. And what any brain scientist will say, you can't think without emotions. And part of the scourge of men, especially, some men, is to think that they can lock their emotions down and just think it out. That's not the way the brain works. That's a fiction. And the fiction is so powerful because men tend to be afraid of emotions, as they also are afraid of women. So they try to lock them down, try to control them. And it's a good thing they can't, because if they did, we wouldn't have had Alabama in the recent election.
That's right.
And I think most of you knew what happened in Alabama. The establishment of the Democratic Party, and I know this is not political, but here it is. The establishment of the Democratic Party was like, we have to, if we're going to win this election, if the Democrats are going to win, we have to get those Trump voters to come back over and vote for Doug Jones. And somebody said, what about the black people? Well, black people, they're not reliable. I mean, that was the message. Almost until a month before the election. This is in Alabama, deeply red state. And they threw a little money at it, but those black women organized.
Yes.
And they organized. With no money, with no help from the national, they organized. And they turned that election around. And they came out and voted. And not only did they vote, they voted at a higher rate than they did in the midterm election when President Obama was in there, which no one thought they would do. 98% of them voted for Doug Jones. And 57% of Doug Jones' support came from black people, and almost all of that was black women. And I met with some of the women. So, and I think that's just emblematic of where we are. And so and I say to people, if people of color, young people, women, if we get out there, we can turn this around. The country is in trouble, not just because of bad policy. The institution's in trouble. The checks and balances in trouble. The world is in trouble. We have Poland, where people are talking about are out-and-out Nazis. And if it's going to be turned around, it's going to be turned around in part because of women and the youth and marginalized people. But beyond people, we have to reclaim and reinvigorate institution. I think about Dr. King's thing about being integrated into a burning house. So we have to put out the fire and build something that all of us can belong to. And that can only be done with the appropriate voice and the appropriate involvement of women and people of color. And I'm going to just throw out one other shout. You mentioned Byron Rustin. And I also think people who have different sexual orientation and disabilities, we have to invite them out of the shadow.
Yeah. Amen. Amen.
Health of the movement at this moment of great peril, where just to our north, I saw today or yesterday, the Tennessee legislature decided to shoot down a bill that would have done the simple thing of condemning Nazis. And they said, no, we're not going to move that forward. We're in a very odd, to say it lightly, 3 minutes, odd space in time right now. What's the health of the movement to fight those types of things? Where are we now?
Well, I agree with my comrades about the potential that we're seeing, potential manifested by women's activities, by youth activities, the Florida teens, and so on and so on. And I think that we need to get strategically sharper in order to make the most of those opportunities. For example, it's made such a difference in Philadelphia that we framed our campaign with regard to the electrical utility that we're targeting in an intersectional way, so that our demand combines economic justice, racial justice, and climate justice all at the same time. And that is making such a difference to the character of the campaign. So a lot of the leadership is coming from people of color, and a lot of the participation also is coming from children and teenagers. And it's a joy to go to jail these days. I mean, we don't allow our children to go to jail, but they're there. You know, they're there rooting for us. And the women are doing, you know, a lot of the articulation as well as the actual work. And the reason why it's such a thriving kind of, like our strategy retreats are, we look forward to strategy retreats because they cook at such a high rate of creativity. And it's all because we think that if we design these things right, the people whose hearts are in the right place and whose anger is mobilized and whose love is available will go into the campaigns that can make a difference in a united way, and as the conception of the Poor People's Campaign was, right, to bring the unity that's needed. So, but I do think that we need a lot more work on the strategy level. I'm pointing to an example where it's happening, but there are lots of examples where people simply rush out, express an opinion, and rush back and hope that that made a difference. And frankly, friends, I don't think it does. It's my field, and I can't find examples where the dial has been moved because of a big expression of opinion.
Yeah.
It needs to be that sustained, which is what the civil rights movement did, right? Selma, Birmingham, Montgomery, the sustained over time campaign is what really delivers the goods, and that's why I'm focusing on this new book.
Thank you. Dr. King, health of the movement.
I'm just going to, because I know our time,
Yeah.
I'm going to say ditto to what he just said
Yeah.
about strategy, because I think that's what's severely lacking today.
Yeah.
Can I just say one other thing? Because I think it's really important. I'm involved with a lot of the young people and a lot of the movements. One of the things that King really brings to the table is how do you actually have this sharp, strategic engagement and not get consumed by hate? And King, I quote him a lot when he talked about, he doesn't say not anger, he said not hate.
Right.
In fact, he talked about righteous indignation. Now, and I see a lot of indignations that's not righteous.
That's right.
And so we don't, in a lot of movements, we still don't believe we can have a movement where hate is not center. And when people read about King, they think, oh, that was a long time ago, that can't happen today. That's the only way it can happen, and that's the only way it can really be sustained.
Thank you so much. Have you all enjoyed this conversation, by the way? I believe I have run over. Oh, no, so we're going to go out for a couple questions. Wonderful. We have time for just a couple questions. And again, hello to everybody on the stream. Would love to go out to the audience for a few folks. Yes, ma'am, please. Yes.
I think it's mics.
Oh, mics are coming. Dr. Alvita,
Please step to this mic if you can. I don't think the cord is long enough. I
yeah,
apologize.
I can hand the seal. Hold on.
I was thinking especially that Reverend Dr. Bernice might have hit it. One of her dad's scriptures that he taught, and Daddy King and my daddy, was Acts 17:26. Of one blood, God made all people to live together on the face of the earth. So really our race, I don't believe is determined by the color of our skin, but our blood is red. So that didn't come up when we deal with racism. You got the race of the giants, the Nephilims, the Rephaims. Those are different races. But human beings, regardless of skin color or sexuality or all those things, we really are human beings. And that's why I believe we can learn to live together as brothers and sisters and not perish together as fools. But what about religion and science saying that there's one race?
It's a great question. It kind of gets to your point, Dr. Powell, about the construction of whiteness. Can we get back to a place? Because, race it is a very real thing now, but it's also a created idea in the West. Can we get back to a pre-race place, or is that not our goal, and is something else our objective? Yeah.
I'm always a little concerned when we say back. Yeah. I think forward.
Great point. Great point.
Yes. And yes, I think we can. I mean, actually, some incredible things are happening. If you look at what's called interrelationships, which is intermarriage between different races, but also different ethnic groups, and interfamilies, they're huge. People are already expressing their ability to love across boundaries. In 1967, the Loving case, a real case where people went to jail. Not the civil rights movement in this case, but for love. So I think, yes, we can, but I agree, it's not enough we also have to have a strategy, we also have to tell stories, we also have to have examples, and it's helpful to have powerful leaders, the King family, helping us with this. I don't believe people will figure this out on their own, because we have too many organized, powerful people on the other side, all the way from the White House, who are stirring hate. We're talking about building walls. We're actually talking about a census that would be a form of ethnic cleansing, where we're really, the national mood is to reclaim this country for white people. And so when we challenge that, we have to say, the country's for everybody. White people is fine, but along with everybody else. And I think having that clear voice that's powerful and strategic and that's grounded in love, I think we can do that.
Keeping an eye on the universal, but still a concern for the particular, as you said earlier. Questions? Yes, please.
Actually, I just have a comment. I just want to thank the panel for the wealth of information that I have received. I'm originally from Arkansas. I have been in the trenches. My mom is 91, and all she talk about is Dr. King. And so I made it my business to study Dr. King. I have chop cotton, I have pig cotton. I am an author and a minister. And I say that it can be done because love and faith conquers all. I have been around racism. I have been in the middle of racism, yet my faith saw me through it all. And so I'm inspired by Dr. King, what he's doing through his daughter. And so I just find it an honor and a privilege. I drove 7 hours from Arkansas to get here tonight, just to be here. Thank you so much.
Amen. So moving. Thank you so much for your testimony. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, peace and love. My name is Abel Mabel Thomas. I'm a state representative in Atlanta. What I want to say to the panel, excellent panel, Reverend Dr. Bernice King, I want to salute you for the work of in education and fellowship that you allowed through the programs you've done. But I have this crazy idea that the King family and the King Center is going to have to actually play absolutely full out right now, because what's going on in the country is so, I don't want to say totally terrible, but it's pretty bad because it's coming from the top. I think that whatever your plans are as it relates to doing this work, it's almost as if you got to go to another level of it, because the answer to what we're dealing with, I believe, is already written. King done wrote it. King done wrote it. But even though he has written it, somewhere or another we have to come and to do something that that takes it, makes it so simplistic, that a kid in the elementary school gonna get it. The middle school kid gonna get it. The high school kid gonna get it. College kid gonna get it. Black Lives Matter's gonna get it. People who are professionals who really like to look at sometimes what's going on rather than actively participate in what's going on, they're gonna get it. And I think that the work that's being done is good, but I think that you're gonna have to do something over and above, because nobody is organized like we think they are to take on what we are doing right now. You believe it or not, the King Center is specifically positioned for a time such as this.
Thank you so much for that comment, and we certainly agree. The one thing that I'd love for Dr. King to talk, about some of the upcoming plans, including the June events, but I would also put this back on those sitting here and those tuning in as well. This is a beloved community, and we have, as a community, to invest in this center and this work. And I hope it's not inappropriate for me to say that. I'm just a volunteer like everyone else. But we have the 50 for 50 campaign, right? And what's the website again, Sarah? MLK50.
Let me make it clear, because we say that each time. It's MLK50forward.org.
MLK50forward.org. The center is doing tremendous work and will continue to do, but its ability to do that work is dependent upon a community rallying around. You've taken a step to be in this place today or to tune in on the stream, but we all have to invest in Dr. King and Mrs. King's vision. We've got to go to MLK50forward.org. We've got to return in June and support these events. We've got to find a way that we can be an asset to this work moving forward. It's not just on the King Center, it's on all of us. But I don't know, Dr. King.
And that is a particular challenge, so I appreciate you mentioning that. Thank you, Mabel. Mabel. We go a long way back. I appreciate you trying to push us. I agree with you wholeheartedly. But one of my challenges is I believe that when you step out into something like what you're talking about, you have to have a strong infrastructure to stand on. And without us having the necessary funding, it makes it difficult. Because just frankly, we have a very lean staff. We don't have every important critical position that we need on this team to do the work that you're talking about. Now, what I'm looking at is how do we form, at this point until we get there, how do we form strategic partnerships with organizations that have particular strengths in areas where we're weak? And so part of what I will be undertaking over the next 12 to 18 months is looking into that, because it is trust me, it is a heavy burden. Every time something happens, I say to myself, where's our voice? And while I can get my voice out there, people don't understand that when I speak, what comes with that is Dr. King. And the demand becomes so enormous that you have to have the infrastructure to support it. Mm-hmm. And so, raising money in this nonprofit world is like a nightmare because we're saturated with nonprofits. And so for us, it's raising money, it's forming those strategic partnerships in order for us to do it. Because I'm being honest, I'm not afraid to go further, but I want to use wisdom in doing it. Yeah. And so if anybody has any ideas, if you know some wealthy people, because there's some things strategically we're trying to do now. One of the things that we are undertaking is a thing called Beloved Community Schools, because I believe that part of changing the trajectory is reaching the next generation. Unfortunately, most of us are so set in stone in our mindset. It's hard to change our thinking. introduce us to new thoughts. I mean, we stop learning. We just do. We think we've kind of arrived and we're settled in what we believe, and that's enough. And so through this beloved community schools initiative, the idea is to get King into the schools. We have a curriculum now that we rolled out with the Atlanta Public Schools from K through 5, and soon to roll out 6 through 12, an MLK curriculum that also incorporates some of the nonviolent teachings, because it's a whole frame of reference that we have to introduce. But in order for that thing to roll out at the level we need to, we got to have the funding to roll it out. And it's a holistic approach. It's not just the curriculum. There's some other things that we're requiring of those schools as well. And so we're trying to develop and fine-tune our education and our training. But it takes money to do that in this climate. So thank you for asking the question. I accept the challenge, but I agree with my brother Joshua that we also need you and your friends and those that are listening, 50 for 50. Everybody can get $50 before the end of this year and support the work that we're doing.
Yeah, and I can't think of a more important and valuable project to support. I mean, maybe I'm just an optimist, but instead of thinking about what happens if we don't meet some of these goals, I'm thinking the crazy thought of, what if this all came together? What if in this place, this King Center, bearing the name and the brand and the legacy of the most important power couple to ever walk the face of this earth, what if this was a catalyst for the type of change we need to see, not just in our country, but in our world? I believe that can happen. That's what I see from my mountaintop. And we're gonna close with this. I would love for you all to just reflect briefly on, personally, your family, your community, the world. What do you see from your mountaintop right now? If you were behind that pulpit at Mason Temple, what as you look out over the next 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years, what's your most hopeful vision? What do you want to see? And we'll start with Dr. Powell. Sorry to just spring it on you all, and go down the list and conclude with Dr. King, and then wrap up our conversation. Yeah.
Well, someone said a crisis is when the old has died and the new has not yet been born. And so we are in a crisis. But the new will be born, and what that birth will be. And I think if we think of ourselves as midwives to help that birth, now it can be born and be, as you said, what was that, Virginia or Kentucky? What was that they wouldn't condemn? Tennessee. It can be born, so it's Nazism. But it also can be born so it's a beloved community. So we're in a state of change. It's not going to go away quickly. It does really require involvement, but it can go either way. And so supporting the King Center, supporting these profound ideas, which in some ways supporting ourselves. And I think if we show up, get involved, be strategic, care about each other, we'll be all right.
Amen. Show up, get involved, be strategic, and care about each other. Write those 4 down, because that's going to get us there. George, your mountaintop.
Amen to those 4. And I want to add a 5th, which is to be creative. That is to ride the tide and be creative, being willing to be very bold in trying nonviolence, even where it has, where there are people pushing back and saying that it can't work. I mean, we have seen recent experiments. I got myself a chance to be an unarmed bodyguard to a lawyer in Sri Lanka who was repeatedly being threatened with assassination. And my friend said, that's ridiculous. You can't be an unarmed bodyguard. And I said, yeah, but Dr. King says it's nonviolence. We've got to experiment.
George is the most interesting man in the world, by the way. He's 80 years old, got arrested last week, and was an unarmed bodyguard in Sri Lanka. Sorry to cut you off, but go ahead, sir.
But I mean, it's an example of something that is just like, out there, right? Well, that will never work. But the civil rights movement would never work, without local law enforcement. Against local law enforcement, against the state, against the federal government sometimes. And it did work. It's that daring to be creative and to go where no one has gone before. And I would make that the 5th step as well.
Wonderful, Dr. King.
And real quick, my father was a prophet, but he said something that I hope we prove him wrong on. He said, one of the tragedies of human history is that the children of darkness are often more zealous and determined than the children of light. From my mountaintop, starting with Black Lives Matter to March for Our Lives, I see the children of light becoming more resolute, vigilant, and determined.
Yeah, say that, say that. Well, friends, we have had a wonderful conversation. Give it up for Dr. Bernice King, George Leakey, and Dr. John Powell. Come back tomorrow for all of the phenomenal panels and have a wonderful evening. Thank you all so much. Bless
Thank you all.
Thank you for watching this beloved Community Talks. Together we win facing poverty, racism, and militarism. This project helps us define the forms of violence that exist in a vicious cycle, or better known as the triple evils. Poverty, racism, and militarism are interrelated and stand as barriers to our living in the beloved community. When we work to remedy one evil, we affect all evils. Nonviolence is the best way to combat the triple evils. Join us in our efforts to educate and train the global community in nonviolence. Please share this message and continue to support the efforts of the beloved Community Talks across the nation. Thank you for your support.